Hi there. Welcome to my monthly telesummit series. Every month, we'll be hosting an hour-long interview with people that have done some amazing things in their lives. Ordinary people like you and me who will intrigue, inspire, and motivate you with their words and actions, and who will tell you not just how they chose to live life, but how they chose to experience it. So this month, I am doing what I actually called a postpartum interview with Johanna Cornelia Boonstra, but it was pointed out to me recently that it's not postpartum because that means after a birth, but postmortem. So it is definitely a postmortem interview, but in a way too, it's a postpartum in that there is a birth of a book that we're going to be talking about, which you see pictured here, Threads, by Johanna Cornelia Boonstra. Excuse me. So Honey, as she liked to be called by her friends, had three incredible lives. Being the daughter of Dutch parents, she was born and raised in the jungles of Indonesia, which at the time was a Dutch colony in the beginning of the 20th century. And she spent the first 20 years of her life there. Then she moved to Holland with her family just in time to be living there when it became an occupied country in World War II. During that time, she met her future husband, Bram, and after the war, they immigrated to the United States. So these three very distinctly different experiences formed a profoundly spiritual, compassionate, and wise individual who had so much to share with the world, from her artistic abilities to her deep faith in the human soul. So today, I'm going to take you on an hour-long journey that will take a look at the documentation of her life through this book, Threads, which is an autobiography, filled with her own vivid illustrations and stories that really reflect her courage, her stamina, and her strength of character. So I'll read excerpts from her book, show some of her charming illustrations, and share my own thoughts on her life and legacy. I have so much to thank her for. After all, she was my mother. So first, I just want to go over a few logistics. If you have any questions or comments during the program today, you can quote unquote raise your hand by commenting in the chat room. I'll try to answer them as presented, but we'll definitely leave time at the end of the program for any questions and comments. Also, I took photos of the illustrations from the book or from some old photographs, and so they are not the greatest, but at least they give you an idea. And for the real thing, you can certainly read the book, which I highly recommend, and you can order that through me. The book is $19.99 plus tax. So I'll be reading excerpts largely from the first 2/3 of the book as I ask her some questions. And many stories will be from America, but much of who she was came from those formative years, as is the case of many of us. Some of you on the call today knew my mother, so I hope I can add to your memories of her. And now I'd like to start in a kind of unconventional way because she was a very unconventional woman. She died on January 28, 2006. And in April of that year, around her birthday, which is on April 8th, we had a celebration of life ceremony on Sanibel Island in Florida, followed by an Indonesian rice table in her honor. When she used to entertain, she would always make an Indonesian rice table, which is something that she grew up knowing how to do. So she would have loved this Indonesian rice table that we had. At that ceremony, I read my tribute to her, and I would like to start with that now because it really gives you a good overview for what you are about to see and hear. So my tribute started this way. I always knew I was in trouble with my mom when I would ask her opinion about something, and she would ask me sweetly, "Do you want an honest answer or a diplomatic one?" Usually, if you got that question, it meant that she did not really like what you were doing or how you were doing it. Actually, I'm sure some of you have had a similar experience with her. We would surely get a very honest and thoughtful answer, presented in a wise and loving way. And that's how she lived every day of her 89 years. She lived a long and colorful life. When our kids were little, whenever Oma came to visit, they would ask her to tell stories of her many adventures in Indonesia, Holland, and America. And I think she delighted in telling them as much as they enjoyed listening. Our kids never tired of the stories, even if they had heard them 20 times before. There were so many lessons in them and uplifting messages. She had so much experience to share. After many years of this, her grandchildren repeatedly said to her, "Oma, you should write a book." So she finally did. All her stories are in her now published autobiography, Threads. While reading the book's drafts, it struck me how my mother lived three remarkable lives in Indonesia, Holland, and America. One of the book's recurring themes is that while living in many places, she was still very Dutch, with characteristic stubbornness and determination. After all, the Dutch decided their country was too small and pushed the ocean back with dams. She just didn't give up, and with a great sense of humor to boot. No matter what the circumstances, she was determined to make the best of things and to move on. Right after Mama passed, we held a farewell dinner party. My brother Eric, his wife Regina, my husband Fernanda and I, our eldest daughter Michelle, and my mother's three earth angels, Lavon, Sandy, Carolyn, and her husband Andy, gathered at Trader's, her favorite restaurant on Sanibel. She always ordered the crab cakes, so we ordered a plate of them in her honor and passed it around so we could each take a bite. I decided we should each come up with a word to describe my mother, to everyone's initial horror. This was going to be very difficult, for she was, after all, quite a character, and coming up with just one word seemed next to impossible. But as we began to go around the table, the words started to come easily. In fact, we ran around the table twice. It was a great process for us to go through, for we managed to turn a sad occasion into one that provided us with laughter and great memories. Above all, and we felt a deep appreciation for having had her in our lives. Of course, Eric and I wouldn't be here if she hadn't been in our lives. Here are some of the words that came up: inspirational, honest, determined, uplifting, sweet, loving, wise, spiritual, and Dutch. These words remind me of a poem very dear to me, Desiderata. It starts out, "Go placidly among the noise and haste, and remember what peace there may be in silence. As far as possible, be on good terms with all persons." It goes on to say, "Speak your truth quietly and clearly, and listen to others, even the dull and ignorant. They too have their story." I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's full of wonderful phrases on how one should try to live life, and I think a very accurate description of the way in which my mother lived hers. It's easy to weave our crab cake words with Desiderata's message. Having grown up in the jungles of Indonesia, my mother did not really have any established religion. Yet she was very spiritual. She had a deep faith that carried her through many difficult times. She shared the strength of her spirituality. She spread cheerfulness and hope, and where she saw sadness, she brought consolation and wisdom. She shared her creative talents with those eager to learn. For all this, she was considered a precious friend by many. She was a terrific artist, gardener, and sewing arts expert, and knowledgeable about so many things. And yet she was humble and down to earth about it all. Her generosity, in fact, could be a real problem. If you admired something in her presence, she'd want you to have it. And even though you would protest, you would somehow end up with it anyway. So more of these words came up at this dinner: creative, sunshine, friend, humble, precious, special, reminding me even more of Desiderata's many words of wisdom. My mother and I often talked about our souls and how she felt that hers was very old. She had a tremendous talent for living in the moment and appreciating even the most simple things. But the word that brought a big smile to all our faces was nut. Life with my mother was always an adventure, from as far back as I can remember. Some of her stories from Indonesia, in fact, are about her love of animals and nature, and some of the crazy things she did as a result. I think she drove her parents a little crazy, and when you read her book, you'll see what I mean. Anyway, she transferred that kookiness to her family and friends, and she was much loved for it. As kids, she had Eric and I running around with butterfly nets, catching butterflies, adopting all kinds of wild animals that had fallen out of trees or had somehow found us. We used to have an iguana for which my mother knit a red sweater. We would take it for walks on the beach, and needless to say, it caused quite a stir. When we were campers at a nature camp, she ordered some tarantulas from Mexico, which arrived in the mail so that we could see them firsthand. Even the mailman couldn't believe it. He was quite traumatized. We used to go to the Mohawk Trail up in the Berkshires in Massachusetts and collect all kinds of rocks and driftwood to bring back to her very beautiful garden. And salamanders, too. One of our favorite crab cake words is intrepid. My mother was fearless. When Fernanda and I were living in Minnesota, we had a bat living in our attic when she came to visit. One day, she just went up there, put on a heavy glove, and grabbed the bat. She then released it outside, but not before showing it to us, declaring that it was really beautiful. Here on Sanibel, she had a porch full of chameleons that had become her pets. They would come and eat out of her hand, and she had some iguanas too, but they escaped. The only creature that she did seem a little wary of were the alligators. She saw everything with a unique eye, and about being a nut, well, she would say, "I'm a nut, but because I know I'm a nut, I'm not really a nut." Our last crab cake word was grateful. My mother appreciated even the smallest things and saw beauty in everything. Rocks, driftwood, moth cocoons, flowers, frogs, people's smiles, butterflies, tarantulas, herons, bats, lizards, and twinkling lights. She loved people and thoroughly enjoyed their company. One of her favorite activities was drinking coffee on the porch and swapping stories with her friends and family. Mother spread her gratefulness out to all she touched. I have her gratefulness now for teaching me about all life's wondrous treasures. Grateful for the life she gave me. Grateful for my family. Grateful for her constant love and support over 57 years. And I am hopeful that I can pass on her legacy of gratitude, wonder, and joy in how I live the rest of my life. The last words of Desiderata are, "With all its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it is still a beautiful world. Be careful. Strive to be happy." As my mother used to say to me on the phone every time we talked, "Geniet van je leven," which translated means enjoy your life. And that's what she taught me to do every day. So that was the tribute, and it gives you, again, as I said, a real overview of what kind of person she was. So I would like now to start with some of these slides. And what you see here is the book cover for Threads. And my mother in this picture is 8 years old with her younger sister, Meta, on the steps of her home in Bulu Blangara on the island of Sumatra, where she had many homes, with one of their servants, and the servants were called Babus, B-A-B-O-E. So she was born on April 8th, 1916, on the island of Java. Her father was an officer in the Dutch colonial army, Holland was a big empire, as many countries at that point were. It was an era of the colonies. So they lived in many different outposts, and there are many illustrations in this book. It was difficult to really pick and choose, but that's what I had to do, so I just picked a few. I call them snapshots, pictures that you have in your mind, or in this case, illustrations by my mother, of moments in your life that you remember in great detail. So one of those pictures is this one of a water buffalo. And I would like to ask her a question, and this is going to be somewhat of a combination of a post-mortem interview, but also kind of a biography of her life. Since she's not here to answer herself, I'm kind of answering for her, but I'm also summarizing some of the experiences that she had. So the first question to her would be, what was it like growing up in the jungles of Indonesia in the 1920s and 30s? And I think she would answer that she was really struck most of all by the great beauty of the place. And also, they experienced great primitive conditions. There was no running water, there was no indoor plumbing, there was a lot of danger in terms of the environment. Some of the places that she lived were very disease-ridden. There were dangerous insects and animals. Some of the places had earthquakes. And also being very isolated from the rest of the world. She really did live in the jungles. She was homeschooled, and yet being very close to nature, and I think her lifelong love of nature came from there. Also, there was lots of diversity. She lived in 10 different places in Indonesia, and her mother really embraced the Indonesian people and combined her own Dutch culture and background with that. During the time that she was in Indonesia, she would say, I had many exotic pets, and her love of animals really came from that. She also found it very peaceful and restful. So on the one hand, it was isolated. On the other hand, it was very peaceful and restful. Unfortunately, too, though, it was a mixed blessing because her childhood was filled with a lot of illness, and some of those really had lifelong effects. One of them was that she really had a chronic calcium deficiency because she really did not get milk and sources of calcium when she was growing up. So she had a lot of problems with her teeth and bones, especially later in life. And there wasn't adequate medical care. So some of the diseases that they had really had to ride themselves out. There was no immediate fix for them. So I'd like to give you a little bit of a reading from her book about life in Indonesia. And just to give you kind of an idea of what I was talking about. So one of the diseases that really was rampant at the time was the plague. And so she says this about that. There were many cases of the plague at the time, and we saw funeral wagons passing our house nearly every day. We didn't dare leave the house every day for quite a while. Our gardener, Kebon, was given strict orders to watch for rats who had fleas, which were the host for the dreaded virus. Rats were rampant everywhere in those days, especially in the kampongs or native villages. The army was given orders to kill rats whenever they could find them. We were lucky, but there were many dangerous diseases in that area, so we got regular inoculations for typhus, cholera, and smallpox. Life on the outposts was quite primitive, and not without hidden dangers. Death appeared often, sometimes from snake bites or from bites from scorpions. People died of tetanus, often being infected by manure. We had no telephone, limited mail, and often messages were sent within a town via a houseboy carrying a slate upon which a message had been written in chalk. We used outhouses, and these were often placed above a river. To take a shower, the houseboy would bring in buckets of water, and we would use a dip pan to pour water over ourselves as we washed. We took this quote unquote shower in the corner of a square concrete wash basin, about 3 feet on either side and about a half-foot deep. It had a drain and a plug just like a bathtub. Dysentery was a common disease. My mother had it once for a week. It made her very sick with blood in her stool. I remember being worried she would die. My mother told me that in her years in Indonesia, she had dysentery 5 times. My father suffered from malaria, which he had the rest of his life and would have real flare-ups, as did many Dutch and Indonesian people. So, as I mentioned, there were a lot of things to combat while they were there. So my mother would really talk, I think, answer that question by saying it was a real mixed blessing. So I'm going to take you to another slide and ask her this question. What did you learn from your experiences there? And she talks a lot in the book about the influence that her mother had on her in terms of creating great human camaraderie and having a real appreciation for differences in race, in culture, in language, in religion. And I think that's part of what she would say developed her deep spirituality. She also had a deep love and respect for nature and for animals and had many, many pets. And this also developed a great curiosity for all of life. And the kindness and compassion that she felt both for the natural world and for humankind really came from her mother. But what you see on this picture here is an experience that she had with Komodo dragons. And I wanted to read that to you because it's really fascinating. One sunny afternoon, I was walking along the beach when I suddenly saw 2 huge animals running out of the jungle. They looked like 2 lizards as large as alligators, and of course I was curious, so I ran after them. The monsters saw me, and they ran towards the ocean and swam away. Not knowing if they were aggressive or not, my mother was frantically calling for me to come back. Later, we found out that they were called Komodo dragons. These prehistoric-looking animals were about 10 feet long and weighed about 250 pounds, and we heard they were very capable of killing a full-grown horse. With no hearing capability, these beasts detect sounds and odor with their tongues. I was told I was very lucky that I was not attacked, but I will never forget the first moment I saw them against the pristine beauty of the tropical beach. This was in a place called Loknia on Sumatra. These huge, graceful reptiles were running and slithering back into the ocean, and they were a magnificent sight. And she talked about this episode with the Komodo dragons many, many times in her life because it was really one of those moments that just created a really huge impression. When I visited Indonesia in 2008, I actually saw them myself in a zoo, and they are pretty impressive. They are really prehistoric looking, as my mother described them, and huge. So the other thing that she really developed from Indonesia that she learned there was a love of gardening. And she started drawing at the age of 4, actually, and really became a pretty proficient artist. She also developed a great sense of responsibility because of the nature of her father being away on tour with the officers and with his troops a lot into the jungles. And she and her mother were basically left on their own. And then her younger sister was born, and she took tremendous responsibility to help her mother to take care of her. So the third question I would pose to her would be, you took several trips to Holland while growing up in Indonesia. How was that? So she would say, and she says this in her book, that it was very eye-opening because Indonesia had been her world. And then all of a sudden, she realized that there was more to the world than just Indonesia. And not just that, but a totally different environment with running water, with toilets. And some of the times that she went there, there was cold and snow, which she had never seen before. And even though they spoke some Dutch in Indonesia, it was a different kind of Dutch. So she had to learn more about the language. And the culture, of course, was very different, including what they have, they call it Sinterklaas, which is a December 5th tradition from way back when Spain occupied the Netherlands for about 80 years, back in the late 1600s. And the whole concept of St. Nicholas came from that, and he's called Sinterklaas in Dutch culture. So that was all a new experience for her as well. And she had never really known her grandparents and was getting to know them and the rest of her family. She was exposed to new illnesses like head colds and bronchitis. And she really more and more was discovering that people were really appreciating her artwork. And I wanted to read a little bit to you about what she says about winter in Holland, and also about her attitude about accepting new challenges, which I think is very telling and very inspiring. So winter in Holland was something new for me, especially when it had been snowing, covering everything with this white stuff. I couldn't believe my eyes when the canal in front of the house froze over and people could walk on water. An old pair of skates were hanging in the tool shed and they fit me quite well. So I tried to skate on water. I tried my hardest to learn to skate well. And after falling many times, I did manage to stay upright, albeit slightly bent over, skating some distance with outstretched hands and arms. But I was never very good at it, especially when it came to stopping. This little handicap, quote unquote, often sent me headfirst into piles of snow or ice, which was a painful experience. But when we were young, we overlooked the bruises of pursuing new challenges. And she really had this attitude throughout her life of pursuing new challenges, even if it meant she was going to get bruised in the process. So in Holland, the mode of transportation was horse and buggy. In Indonesia, here's the right slide, sorry. In Indonesia, it was donkey and cart. So in a way, the transportation mode was very similar. But she talks a lot about how returning to Indonesia was always really, really welcoming for her, because to her, this was her country and a really beloved country. So later in life, she wanted my brother and I, Eric, and I to see Indonesia. So we promised her that we would go and do that. And my Aunt Neta always considered Indonesia her country. She never became a United States citizen, even though she too moved to the United States, married an American, and lived here for many, many years. And when she passed, just about the same time as my mother, actually, her wish had been to have her ashes spread in Indonesia. So my brother and I and my eldest daughter, Michelle, traveled to Indonesia in 2008. And one of our larger purposes for doing that was to take the ashes of Neta and spread them both in Sumatra and in Java. And it was an incredible experience, particularly when we were on Sumatra. We were taking a tour with a guide, and he was showing us some of the sights of Sumatra, but also would show us some of the hotels. And it turns out that one of the hotels that we visited had been a hotel that my mother had taken my father to. Same thing, she wanted him to see Indonesia. And so in the mid-1990s, they had gone there. And it turns out that the guide that we had been my parents' guide and remembered them well. So it's moments like these that you really start to think, oh my God, it's such a small world. So the fourth question I would ask my mother would be, as you got older and entered high school, What did you feel in comparison with your classmates? And I asked that question because she expressed a lot in her book how difficult it was for her, having been homeschooled for much of her preteen years. It was not till she got into high school that she started to go to a school. And her experiences both in Holland and coming back to that school in Indonesia was that she was not well prepared, even with the homeschooling. And some of the exams that she had to take had reflected a lot of things that she would have learned in a more social environment. So she would say that it made her feel very stupid and very naive, and she became very stressed and developed all kinds of stomach problems. And that she really was feeling at this point that she had gained a lot of wisdom, but she was not smart. And luckily, as things evolved, she started to get more feedback that she was indeed smart, and with hard work and concentration, she really was able to accomplish a lot of things. She also said that she would say that she really felt that she lacked a lot of sophistication, and that gave her a huge inferiority complex that really stayed with her the rest of her life. And she also would say that she wished she could go back to that simplicity and happiness of youth. And yet, as I indicated earlier, that youth was very mixed with very difficult situations. And her family life too was difficult because her father was very strict, and she often had to take responsibility for her sister. So it was a mixed blessing. Here's another picture that kind of depicts the environment in Indonesia, shows some of the wildlife that was there, these monkeys. And this is a picture of a tea plantation in Indonesia. And she, again, talks a lot in her book about how people were so happy. It seemed like the more simple their life was, the more happy they were. And it really established a belief in her that a happy childhood really sets the stage for the rest of your life. So she talks a little bit about that in the book, in this passage. Indonesian kids were quite happy. I loved to watch them playing in the river or gaming with their homemade clay marbles. They loved to dance and sing, and at a young age they were taught to become part of the working unit, creating a close bond with their families and the villagers, and they loved it. The tea factory was fascinating. It takes quite a long time to cure tea leaves, and there are many different types and grades. I never knew how much work was involved before the tea's ready for the marketplace. When you walked through the factory, the smell was heavenly, and you could see that the workers were very happy. The pay was good, and the so-called picking girls were paid by the pound for the leaves, which gave them an incentive to work fast. Most of the time they worked in groups, and you could hear them talking and laughing and singing together. So there are many, many stories of all these formative years in Indonesia, and it really gave her the strength to get through this very next stage of her life, which was the stage in Holland. But before I get into that part, I do want to say that unfortunately, her father underwent a court martial because of a very messy situation with one of his officers, and he became falsely accused of some um, behavior among the troops that was not really acceptable behavior. And it was a very upsetting thing at the time. But as she says later in the book, it's a really good thing that he went through that and was forced to move to Holland, because shortly after that, the war broke out, and he and all of them probably would have ended up in a Japanese concentration camp. And so sometimes what happens to us, even though at the moment we think it is so upsetting and so disappointing, this is what my mother would say, that it really, you look back at it and realize that it really had a good effect. And actually, things turned out for the better. So my next question to her would be, now you're in Holland, what happened there? So of course, one of her big things for that would be to say that she was adjusting to an entirely new way of life and really feeling so sad about having to leave Indonesia. She also started to really look at what she was going to do with the rest of her life, and she really wanted to go to art school, but because of financial reasons in the very beginning, she ended up going to a home economics school for a couple of years first. And a lot of her art needlework that she developed so beautifully afterwards, and she would say it was one of the things that gave her great joy and satisfaction because she was able to make so many things for people as a result. And I still have some of the things that she made, um, really gave her a wonderful way to connect with people. She did eventually go to art school and she became a teacher in art. Also during this time, she started wearing glasses, and again, this inferiority complex that I was talking to later, she would bring it up, I'm sure, if we were to question her, how this really interfered with her self-image. Wearing glasses was not something at the time that was acceptable. And particularly because she was in her early 20s and she was dating and becoming more social and making friends, it had a tremendous impact on her self-image. She also started traveling, and in particular, she noted this one trip to Belgium that she took with some friends, and that was all very carefully documented. And she would say, if I were to ask her about that trip, it was one of the highlights of her time there, that she absolutely loved it. But it also came with great difficulty because things had been brewing in Europe between Germany and all these other countries. And while she was there, they became very conscious of that. And by the time they got back, sure enough, war was breaking out. So I just wanted to read you that passage. Right after I returned from Belgium, World War II broke out. Everybody knew that it would change our lives drastically. We didn't know how badly Holland would be hit, and we couldn't even imagine at the time how utterly horrible the next 5 years would be for millions of people in Holland and elsewhere. We followed the news intently. Our anxiety grew with each passing day as we heard of countries being swallowed up by the Germans. We felt as if a giant monster was gradually approaching us, eating everything in its path. The radio newscasts kept us informed that the Dutch government was still hopeful that the Netherlands would stay neutral as they did in World War I. But when Germany invaded Czechoslovakia and later Norway and Denmark, we weren't so sure anymore. So on the 30th of April, 1940, all furloughs were canceled and our military forces were put on alert. And I'm going to follow that reading immediately with another one because it's a very striking image that I am going to show you on the next picture. And she talks about this moment. And remember, I was talking about these snapshots that we have sometimes of things that stay with us for the rest of our lives. So this illustration really depicts one of those moments. It was bright daylight, but the seacoast was lit by fires and bombs exploding everywhere. Planes were shooting at each other in the sky, and as they circled around each other, some would drop to the earth in flames. From some of the downed planes, I could see parachutes opening. I prayed for those who had a chance to stay alive. The noise was so loud that I covered my ears. The explosions seemed unending. I thought to myself that if hell really existed, then this is what it must be like. There was quite a steep dune near to where I stood, and a rabbit hole was visible on its slope, and just as I looked in that direction, a rabbit came out, looked around, and hopped up the hill. When he reached the top, he stood on his hind legs perked up his ears, and stood motionless, watching the action. I was surprised to see how calmly the rabbit took in all the noise from the battle in the plains. He just turned around towards me and started to preen himself. I guess he didn't see me because first he pulled down one of his ears, fluffed it up, cleaning it with his teeth, and did the same with the second ear and on down his body. I watched that rabbit for at least a half an hour, admiring its composure. When at last the rabbit decided to go back into its hole, I felt a moment of peace as if time were standing still. I'll never forget that rabbit because it taught me a valuable lesson. Take life as it comes. Make the best of it, and don't worry too much about things, except with calm, that over which we have no control. And really, if I were to further ask her about the war and her experience there, that is really how she feels that she got through it, that she just accepted things and had this perseverance to get through all the experiences that she had there. Which brings me to that sixth question. What experiences did you have in those 5 years of occupation, and how did your background in Indonesia help you to get through it? Well, first and foremost, I think she would answer by saying that they lived in a constant state of terror, anxiety, and fear. I remember her telling me about all the bombings and the raids and the sirens going off, and that there was always a feeling of total terror whenever that would happen. And then hunger. It wasn't so bad in the very beginning, but by the last year and a half or so of the war, the Dutch were really starving, and they were turning to things like tulip bulbs to eat and to stay alive. And many farmers out in the country would help the Dutch people with food, but they too would have very limited resources, and also got raided a lot by German troops and would not have enough to be able to distribute. So one of the things that happened to my mother is that somewhere in that eating Dutch tulip bulbs, she must have eaten either a daffodil bulb or a hyacinth bulb, and developed incredible intestinal problems, which really she never recovered from. The rest of her life, she had problems with that. And she used to go on what they call hongertochts, which were hunger journeys, riding their bicycles out in the snow in the countryside. So she would talk a lot about the resourcefulness and the courage that was needed, and also that the Dutch people were not all that aware of what was happening to the rest of the world, or to the Jews for that matter. There was some awareness that they were disappearing, but they didn't know exactly what was happening to them. There were, of course, rumors and a lot of horror and fear of what was happening with that. One good thing that happened to her that she would talk about in the war was that she met Brahm, and she's got some really funny stories of how that all came about. And I'm not going to read that to you because of time, but it was a really great relationship that kept them both going throughout the war, because she met him at the beginning, and they really supported one another and one another's families. There were a lot of family difficulties at the time too. Meka, her younger sister, joined the Dutch underground, and so that was very worrisome and very difficult. And my father was a chemical engineer, and especially towards the end of the war, he really had to go into hiding because the Germans were looking for scientists and engineers to help with their war machine. So my mother would have said that she was very, very worried and anxious about that as well. So what she found helpful, she would say, I believe, from Indonesia, was the idea that she was raised living on very little, and that really made her extremely resourceful. And then that Dutch stubbornness, that you're going to make things work no matter what. And also a great survival instinct. After all, she was raised in the jungles of Indonesia with great dangers of disease and dangers from animals and the environment and natural phenomena like earthquakes. So she really got a survival instinct on how to cope with all of that. And as this picture reflects, that love of nature and finding beauty even in the horror of things and things being so difficult. And she really talks a lot in the book again and would say, in answer to this question, that she found art was really her therapy, as you can see in this picture, for depicting things. And she had developed a great strength of character, largely from her experience in Indonesia and also from her own parents as well. She also would say that there were a number of times when she really became under threat of her life, and it created a tremendous sense of the value of her life and how human interaction sometimes can make such an incredible difference. There was a movie that I saw a few years ago. It was called the Twins. And it was about these two young girls who lost their parents at a very early age. They were Dutch girls. And these twins were split between the family because they couldn't go to one place, unfortunately. And one of the branches of the family lived in Germany, and the other branch lived in Holland. And it's just a fascinating movie as to what happens to both of those girls and how the war was presented on each side. And it really illustrated so beautifully how difficult it was for both sides. And it also brought up a lot of the issues of forgiveness, which with the recent passing of Nelson Mandela, I think is very much on our minds, how powerful that can be and how that really releases one to be able to go on and not repeat history. So I wanted to show you a quick photo of my mother at this age that she was, Hani Lakesma. Lakesma was her maiden name, and this is what she looked like during World War II. And then I have this picture. Again, it's a little bit fuzzy because I was taking pictures of pictures. But this is Hani and Brahm on their wedding day, September 28th, 1945. And again, in the book, she talks a lot about the preparations for this wedding and what it all meant, and would answer the question on how was all of that, that she actually had to borrow a wedding gown and had to mend it in many places. And it just, to make this happen was a tremendous effort. And yet she feels that it was one of the most important days of her life, as many of us can say that it was. And she was very happily married because they'd been through so much together already. And then she would really say, well, in answer to the question, let's say I would ask her this question: what were the challenges, joys, and difficulties of your new life? Because now we're moving on after World War II, as being a wife, as being a mother, and then moving to the United States. So one of the things she would say is that she was surprised that she could be a mother at all. They had gone through so much, not starvation, but real hunger. And I think many people were really affected physically by that. So she really did not think that she would be able to have a child. So that was a wonderful revelation that she was able to do that. And also what happened after they got married is that my father was looking for work, and Holland was pretty ravaged from World War II. So they really started looking at other countries in order to be able to do that. And that's how they ended up going to the United States. And if I were to ask her how that was, she would say that it was extremely difficult to leave her family. And yet, ironically, her mother and father really understood that because that's exactly what they had done to their parents when they had moved to Indonesia. So it really was a bittersweet kind of opportunity for them. And I already was around at that time when they went to the United States. Now, my mother was actually pregnant with my brother on the boat going to the United States. And so he was born here and became a United States citizen automatically. So I'm going to read to you a little bit about her feelings of leaving Holland, just to give you kind of an idea of, how we sometimes just have to make the best of things. After some difficulty weighing the pros and cons of the situation, we decided to go to the United States. Bram would be able to go to work for the Cabot corporations, and he felt that, most like European cities that we were used to, Boston would require the least adjustment for us. Even so, it was a big decision. In a way, it was heartbreaking because it meant leaving family and friends to start all over again in a new country with new surroundings, with a different language and new customs. And yet I never really liked Holland, with its cold and wet climate and the often narrow-minded attitudes of its people. People who had lived in the Dutch East Indies were much more broad-minded and companionable. Of course, there were exceptions to this, and we did have wonderful Dutch friends. So, as I mentioned, it really was a very bittersweet experience. So I want to show you this next slide. So this was their first American home. They first moved to Boston, where they lived in a hotel called the Parker House for about 6 months as they were looking at different communities around the Boston area. And I still have some snapshot moments of living in that hotel. And it actually was a very difficult thing for her, for my mother, because she felt very lonely and very isolated. So again, if you ask her how was all of that, she would really bring up a lot of feeling very lonely and very isolated in terms of the culture, in terms of the language. She thought she'd been pretty proficient in English, but here she was being exposed to American English, which was very different than the English that she had learned. And it's interesting, they moved to New England, and of course there was a lot of cold and snow there, but even though she had been living in Holland, she had been raised in the tropics, and I think never was able to get used to the cold. She was always rubbing her hands together and never completely being able to get warm. But slowly she made friends, and through my father's work, they got more connected, and she started becoming known much more for her artwork and her needlework, and really started becoming a member of the community. So I would ask her then, what things were especially meaningful and impactful in this American life? And one of the things that I think she would say is that some of the people that she met early on became lifelong friends and had a tremendous impact on her. One of those people was Madeline McMaster, was her name, and she was a Christian Scientist. And actually, my father had been raised Christian Science, and that had a tremendous impact on the direction that their early life in the United States took. My mother actually switched us to the Congregational Church after a few years, but Madeline McMaster, stayed our friend and almost a family member for the rest of her life. She also, during that time, met someone called Al Busowitz. And Al Busowitz was part of the Audubon Society and ran a facility in Sharon, Massachusetts called Moose Hill. And my mother, with her love of nature and animals and all of that, started to really get connected with him and with Moose Hill, and actually became a counselor there, and we became campers there. And this next picture kind of shows you that we started to do all kinds of activities there, including this activity that my mother started, which was butterfly hunting. And I think I alluded to it a little bit in my tribute in the beginning, that this was one of the things that she had us doing on a regular basis. And this kookiness of my mother's was really translated into the joy of all God's creatures that she felt. And there's actually a chapter in her book called that. And so she relates many stories of her experiences with insects and animals and the tarantulas. And remember, I talked about the iguana, so I wanted to show you that picture. Here is this iguana in his little red sweater. We had a leash on it, and we used to take him for walks on the beach. And yeah, he made a tremendous impression on people. So my mother she would answer saying, I know that I did things really in an unconventional way, but in a way it opened up people's eyes and helped them to see the wonder and beauty in lots of things. She also loved this house that they built shortly after the house that they lived in initially in Sharon. This house was also in Sharon. And they had this house built and spent like 28 years there before they moved on after my father retired. Something else that gave her great joy was the discovery of the Mohawk Trail in the Berkshires in Massachusetts. And this simplicity that she felt when she was in Indonesia came back to being here in these very primitive cabins out in this wondrous countryside in the Berkshires. And we went there many times, several times a year, and it became a huge part of our childhood. And I think my brother and my appreciation of nature and of animals and of the beauty of things really does come from our experiences with her, that she basically she would say, if I were to ask her, that one of the things that she really loved to do was expose people to really looking at things and really appreciating things. Okay, so we're going to move on a little bit because I am really getting close to the time that we're ending. And as I said, this American chapter, even though many things happened to her in the United States, the formative years of Indonesia and World War II in Holland are really what I wanted to concentrate on today. So I'd like to just say again that the adventures and the experiences that she involved us as children with was just a wonderful thing that gave us a really happy childhood, and something that she came to appreciate in Indonesia. And many years in Sharon were filled with this what I would say is a normal mixture of joy and sadness and health issues and all kinds of parenting challenges. She taught art classes. She became an established member of the garden club, and really was an important member of the Sharon community. But the way she handled all of these things was anything but normal. And I hope that I have been able to relate that a little bit in this sort of interview / biography of her life. One of her mottos that really became a theme throughout her experiences were this kill with kindness and acceptance and going with the flow and persevering. She also many times found that if she showed a special compassion and kindness to people, no matter how mean they were or how abrasive or how difficult, that it was very disarming to do that. So my father retired. Just before that happened, my mother had a real sadness with my brother. He, at the age of 28, had a diving accident and became a paraplegic, and is still so today. But what he has done with his life is so amazing, and I often say that he is happier than a lot of people walking around. And I think in large part it is due to the strength and perseverance and messages that my mother gave us to be able to rise up to challenges in life. Because I too have had some tremendous health issues and some real difficulties. And we've been able to get through them because of the things that my mother taught me. So this unfortunately just happened before they moved to Sanibel. They had bought some property on this island a few years before, and my mother was so excited because finally she was going to a warmer climate. So this view is actually the view that she had from her porch, which I alluded to again in the tribute, that she used to love to be on that porch and entertain family and friends with stories and having coffee there. And she spent many, many years doing this. And again, she was back into a quiet, restful place, lots of nature around. She became a very important member of the artist community there. But again, the happiness that she felt on Sanibel was always mixed with sadness and trauma between Eric's accident, my health issues, and then my father um, did become very ill and developed what we thought at the time was Alzheimer's. Luckily, just before that happened in the mid 1990s, they were able to go several times actually back to Holland, back to Indonesia. My mother was able to show my father Indonesia, and he finally was able to understand my mother better, of what made her tick. And if I were to ask her how that was, she would say that was such a wonderful moment to have Ram finally understand a lot of what she was about. And she had this wonderful story, which she also relates in the book, about being in the living room of one of the homes. And it was one of the homes that she had grown up in. And looking up, and the ceiling was still the same. And it was 50 years later. And, just having this incredible sense of the timelessness of things. So it was another beautiful moment that she relates. So I want to give you another view of her Sanibel garden. And this really, her garden was a great source of comfort. She built it up from nothing and just loved all the wildlife that was there. And some of these birds that you see here in this picture, she actually became friends with. They got really tame and she was feeding them, and just about all these animals that she had throughout her life, she embraced in such a way that they almost became pets to her. For my children, it was a wonderful place to come and visit. She was a wonderful grandmother. She was a great art teacher who gave my kids art lessons and many lessons of life. As I again related in the tribute to her in the very beginning, she would tell them all these stories of things that had happened to her in Indonesia and in Holland, and then also in the United States. So another happy occasion before things again turned around once more was for my parents' 50th wedding anniversary, which you see pictured here. And it was a wonderful occasion. And again, they had such a close relationship because of all that they had gone through together. So this was in 1995. My father died in 1998, and he at this moment was already starting to get some symptoms of this Alzheimer's. And he died on January 11th, 1998. And my mother relates a really wonderful story of giving him permission to go, because he had been in a facility for about a year and a half and was hanging on. And I think part of what she would say was helping him to hang on was this fear of what was going to happen to her. So she relates a really beautiful story of letting him go. And that happened very quickly. So then she had another 8 years of being on Sanibel on her own, and one of the things that she developed as a part of the art community there was a poster for Sanibel Island, and that's what you see pictured here. So those 8 years, she just continued to instruct with art lessons. She continued to inspire everybody that she met and to interact and connect with people. We used to call her Chatty Cathy, and I think I have some of that too, that she would always strike up a conversation and always make some kind of connection with people. And it was always amazing to see how they would relate to her. So my final question to her, and I know we're running a little bit over here, would be, what advice do you have for us in living life to the fullest, taking its pains, sorrows, joys, and wonders in stride? And so I'm going to read to you some of what she says about this. And again, I really encourage you, if you like some of the things that I've been telling you about her, to read her book. It is just a wonderful set of stories of everything that has happened to her and how she thinks about things. So she says, Ingrid and our newborn, Eric, so this was at the beginning of coming to the United States, kept me very busy. I loved my children dearly, and I always had the feeling that God specifically gave me those wonderful kids to take care of for him for a while. That's why I tried never to own them, but to give them enough freedom to develop in their own precious ways so that they would become happy adults. And that she did. She taught us to get through so many challenges and hurdles with grace, with kindness, and resolve. Her ending words in every phone conversation that we had, both my brother and I with her, has always struck me. Geniet van je leven, which means enjoy your life no matter what. So she also ends her book with her philosophy, which I'm not going to read to you because it's kind of lengthy. But it is a really wonderful tribute to her life and her own ideas about what life has taught her. So here she is, just before she died on January 28th, 2006. And all that I can say at this point is all that I am today is largely due to her. And if I were to ask her what mattered to her, that would be it. That the impact that she had on people would have a tremendous influence on how they would live their lives. And this is why I would feature her this time, because that's what these telesummits are all about. Finding someone who inspires and motivates you. So, as I mentioned, I've had many challenges and difficulties and significant moments of happiness and sadness and turmoil in my life, as so many of us have. And finding someone like this helps you to deal with them in a way that really reflects what you consider someone to be your role model and mentor. And so she was my mentor. Who is yours? Thank you so much for listening. And here is my ending card. As you can see, I'm a life transitions and caregiver coach, and I also like to call myself a possibilities agent. And part of that philosophy is because of what my mother has taught me. So I then want to pass that on and help other people with this as well. So again, thank you so much for your attention today. I hope you have enjoyed this. I hope I have inspired you to read this book. And I look forward to hearing from you. Take care. Bye-bye for now. And thank you so much for being part of this monthly telesummit series. Bye-bye.